You pull on your socks this morning. Your toe brushes against the seam. It's a tiny ridge of thread, nothing more. But for your great grandfather, that same seam was a death sentence. How could a thread decide who lived and who died? The answer begins in mud. Not just any mud. You know the kind. Thick, cold, heavy. Mud that lay in the trenches of the First World War. Imagine it's you, standing in a narrow ditch. The walls are held together by rotting timbers. The bottom is slick with water and clay. How long do you think you could stand it? You haven't felt your toes in hours. This is the birthplace of trench foot. Your feet are sealed in damp boots for days. They never dry. The wool sock clings to your skin. Can you feel the seam yet? It presses across the tips of your toes. Each step is a tiny act of violence. Friction grinds the seam into your flesh. What does that feel like after a day? After a week? At first you feel nothing. The cold numbs the nerves. But beneath the surface, your skin is wearing away. A blister forms. It fills with fluid. The seam saws back and forth. The blister bursts. Raw skin meets filthy water. Bacteria flood in. What happens when an open wound sits in that soup? Inflammation swells your foot to twice its normal size. The flesh turns blue, then black. A medical officer later writes that the smell of rotting tissue hung over the trenches like a fog. Gangrene sets in. The surgeon has no choice but to amputate. And you were just trying to hold a line, and there was nothing you could do. The British Army recorded over 74,000 cases of trench foot in 1915 alone. In the worst winters, a soldier could lose both feet in a week. Why was it so common? A researcher named Colonel Charles Lynch would later compile the American medical data. He wrote that trench foot was the greatest cause of wastage in some units. The Army was losing men faster to wet feet than to bullets. And no one at first understood why some soldiers survived while others did not. What was their secret? The answer was hidden in the sock. Army-issued socks were machine-made. Knitting machines were the pinnacle of industrial progress. They could produce thousands of pairs a day. But every machine had a fatal flaw. Can you guess what it was? To close the toe, the fabric had to be joined. That join created a seam, a thick, raised ridge of wool running right over the most tender part of the foot. Imagine wearing those socks in a flooded trench. The seam rubs your toes raw with every movement. You might not even notice the blister forming. The cold stole your sensation. But the damage was already done. The seam had created a portal for infection. It was a perfect trap designed by speed and ignorance. How could a machine know? Yet some soldiers received different socks. Socks sent from home, knitted by mothers, sisters, wives, and girlfriends. What was different about them? They had no toe seam. Because they were not made on industrial machines. They were made by hand, in the round, on 4 needles. A clever method closes the toe seamlessly. A historian of wartime women's work, Lucy Adlington, has examined thousands of these patterns. She notes that the Red Cross issued strict knitting instructions. Rule 1, the sock must be seamless. Rule 2, the toe must be finished with a Kitchener stitch. This technique grafted the stitches together without a ridge. The result was a smooth, continuous tube of wool. Does that sound familiar? Today you know the Kitchener stitch is a clever knitting trick. But then it was a matter of life and death. The stitch was named after Lord Kitchener himself. He was the British War Minister who endorsed the seamless sock. Why did a War Minister care about knitting? Because he saw the medical reports. He understood that a seam could kill as surely as a bullet. Medical officers began to notice a pattern. What did they see? Soldiers who wore the hand-knit seamless socks developed far fewer cases of trench foot. A podiatrist today, Dr. Emily Spleichel, explains why. She studies how friction and pressure create blisters and ulcers. Any seam, she says, acts as a focal point for pressure. In wet conditions, that focal point becomes a portal for bacteria. Remove the seam, and you remove the portal. Does that make sense? The science is clear. But in 1915, this was a revelation. So what did the industrial sock do wrong? It prioritized speed over the shape of a human foot. The machine could not feel. The human hand could. And that made all the difference. The industrial sock was a master of destruction. The hand-knit sock was a medical device better than the factory's output. A grandmother with knitting needles was saving more lives than a textile mill. How strange is that? The scale of the knitting campaign was staggering. In America, the Red Cross launched a drive to knit seamless socks for soldiers. They called them trench socks between 1917 and 1918. American volunteers knit over 24 million pairs. In Britain, Queen Mary's Needlework Guild collected millions more. Who knit them? School children learned to knit. Men recovering in hospitals knitted. Women held knitting parties in church halls. They unraveled old sweaters to salvage yarn. What was going through their minds? Each stitch was a silent prayer. Each sock was a personal message, a small, seamless shield against the horror of the trenches. But there was a dark twist. Even as seamless socks proved their worth, the army kept issuing machine-made socks. Why? Because factories could make millions. Hand-knit socks were precious and scarce. Supply officers faced a brutal math. They could give every soldier a flawed sock, or some soldiers no sock at all. What would you choose? A sock with a seam was still better than bare feet in frozen mud. The seam killed slowly, but the cold killed quickly. So the cheap seamed sock remained the standard issue. And soldiers kept dying from the flaw. So the race continued. Volunteers knit faster and faster. Patterns were simplified to save time. The Kitchener stitch became a national skill, taught in schools and printed in newspapers. Did it work? Medical report from 1917, edited by Colonel Charles Lynch, noted that Trenchfoot still claimed 20% of casualties in winter months. The seam was winning. The machine was winning. And the human body paid the price. What does this have to do with you today? You live in a world where that seam rarely matters. Your feet are mostly dry. You walk on pavement, not mud. If a seam irritates you, you might get a blister on a long walk. You throw the sock away. You never think of gangrene. But the seam is still there. Every pair of machine-made socks you own probably has one. Have you ever really looked at it? It sits there, folded against your toe. That tiny ridge of thread is a ghost. The ghost of an industrial design that once competed against death. It reminds you that progress doesn't always mean better. Sometimes the handmade, the slow, the ancient wins. The seam in your sock is a story about mismatch. The scale of industrial production met the intimate scale of the human body. The two didn't fit. Why not? The body's vulnerability was invisible to the machine's logic. A machine can't feel the friction. Grandmother's hands could. So tomorrow morning, when you pull on your socks, feel for that seam. Run your finger along its ridge. It might annoy you, but now you know the secret it carries. That tiny thread once decided who lived and who died. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel. A new story every week.